She smiled at me, and in that moment, I believed every word she said, but that smile was the beginning of a trap I would later regret falling into. I first met her at a friend's small gathering on a rainy Friday evening. The kind of party where people cluster around couches, nursing drinks, and laughing at inside jokes only they understand. She walked in like she belonged there, but in a way that made you want to protect her, like she carried a story of sorrow the world hadn't noticed yet. Her presence was magnetic. She laughed softly, eyes darting around nervously, but with a glimmer that suggested a deep intelligence behind the fragility. I didn't know it then, but every movement, every word, was carefully measured. I was immediately drawn to her, and before I knew it, I was listening to her recount stories of betrayal, heartbreak, and loneliness. She doesn't have anyone, she said softly, her voice breaking just slightly. No one to trust, no one who really cares. I remember feeling a surge of sympathy. This was someone who seemed to have suffered endlessly. She spoke of past relationships where friends had turned on her, family who misunderstood her, colleagues who plotted against her. It was exhausting just to imagine, yet I found myself leaning closer, wanting to comfort her. Everyone around us was equally captivated. She had a way of telling stories that made it impossible not to believe her. Her gestures were subtle, a hand brushing her hair, a trembling lip, a soft intake of breath, that made her look vulnerable, helpless even. And yet, beneath it all, I sensed a spark. Something sharp, something intelligent. By the end of the evening, I was convinced she was innocent, a victim of circumstance, a person the world had misunderstood. I offered to help her with a minor work issue she mentioned in passing, and she thanked me with that same disarming smile. It felt like trust had been exchanged in a single glance, but little did I know, that trust was exactly what she wanted. As I left that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than she was letting on. But I brushed it aside, telling myself I was just being cautious. Who could suspect someone who looked so lost, so fragile, could be anything but honest? I didn't know yet that her story was a carefully crafted performance, designed to draw me, and everyone else, into her world of deception. I thought I was imagining things, until the contradictions became impossible to ignore. A week after that first meeting, I started noticing small things, tiny inconsistencies in the stories she told. At first, I brushed them off. Maybe she was tired, or perhaps her memory played tricks on her. But there was a pattern, subtle yet persistent, that refused to go away. One evening, she told me she had been betrayed by a close friend at work. Her eyes welled up as she described the emotional pain, and how she had no one to turn to. I felt my chest tighten with sympathy. Yet, when I casually mentioned the incident to another friend, the reaction was odd. They seemed confused, even a little surprised. Apparently, nothing of the sort had happened. I didn't say anything at the time. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, I told myself. But then came another incident. She had told me she was struggling financially, barely scraping by, and I offered to help with a small loan. She hesitated, gave me a long, grateful look, and said she would never accept charity lightly. Later, I learned through another mutual acquaintance that she had recently gone on a shopping spree, posting pictures online of new clothes and expensive dinners. It was impossible to ignore any longer. Something wasn't right. But what unsettled me the most wasn't just the lies, it was her charm, the way she could tell them without losing a shred of credibility. She had perfected the act of innocence, of vulnerability, of victimhood. I started observing her more closely, watching her interactions with others. She had a subtle control over every conversation, every reaction. If someone questioned her, she would tilt her head, blink slowly, and speak in a tone so gentle it disarmed even the most skeptical listener. Yet behind that gentle tone, I could sense calculation, an intelligence she wielded like a weapon. I remember sitting in my room one night, replaying conversations in my mind, feeling a cold knot of doubt in my stomach. Could someone be so skilled at deception? Was it possible to manufacture victimhood so convincingly that everyone, including me, would fall for it? By the end of that week, I realized I had a choice: continue trusting her blindly or start paying attention to the warning signs that were now impossible to ignore. I decided on caution. I would keep observing, quietly, like a detective in the shadows, gathering pieces of a puzzle that I was only beginning to understand. And so began the slow, tense realization that the woman I thought was fragile and innocent might actually be a master manipulator, using her carefully constructed victimhood as a weapon. She wasn't just lying, she was controlling reality, and I was finally starting to see the threads of her deception. By the time part 3 begins, I had started noticing patterns in her behavior. The inconsistencies I'd previously dismissed were no longer small, they were the edges of a much larger, carefully woven web. It wasn't random, it was calculated, precise, and almost hypnotic. She had everyone in our circle wrapped around her finger. A casual disagreement would soon turn into a confession of wrongdoing from someone else. Friends who had never even argued with her apologized, convinced they had hurt her somehow. It was subtle, almost invisible manipulation, but once you noticed it, it was unmistakable. One evening, I witnessed it firsthand. A mutual friend had casually mentioned a past disagreement. She reacted with quiet hurt, blinking slowly, shaking her head slightly, her voice trembling just enough to draw sympathy. Within minutes, the friend was apologizing profusely, convinced he had done something wrong, even though he hadn't. Watching her work was like seeing a spider tend to its web, every strand placed perfectly to trap her prey. I began documenting these incidents, mentally cataloging them, trying to understand her methods. She was skilled in every aspect of deception, body language, tone, timing. She knew when to look vulnerable, when to smile, and when to feign exhaustion to elicit concern. And everyone, including me, was too captivated to notice until it was too late. What disturbed me most was how naturally she could manipulate multiple people at once. She would tell one person a dramatic story of betrayal while casually contradicting it to another, adjusting the narrative just enough so that no one would notice inconsistencies. Every interaction became a performance, every relationship a stage for her theatrics. And then came a more personal moment. A friend of mine, who had known her for years, confided in me. She had told him a story of being betrayed by her family, painting herself as the tragic heroine. But the story didn't add up, details contradicted what I had already learned, and he had started noticing the same subtle manipulations I had. Together, we began connecting dots. The realization hit hard. She wasn't just lying sporadically, she was living a lie, and she had mastered the art of making everyone believe it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every conversation, every laugh, every tear I had witnessed. The truth was terrifying. Someone so seemingly innocent, so fragile, could possess such a calculated, almost predatory mind. She had crafted a persona so convincing that even the most skeptical could be fooled. And as I lay there, piecing together the first real outline of her web of lies, I realized something chilling. If I wanted to expose her, I would have to navigate her world carefully, without her realizing I was watching. One wrong move, and I could become just another pawn in her performance. The truth was far darker than I ever imagined, hidden behind the mask she wore so flawlessly in public. By now, I had begun to investigate her life more carefully, though cautiously. Something about her charm, her vulnerability, and the way she drew people in felt almost dangerous. I needed proof, not just suspicions, to understand who she really was. It started with small things, old social media posts that contradicted the stories she told me, messages she accidentally left open on her phone when no one was looking, and subtle hints from mutual acquaintances. Each tiny fragment painted a picture that didn't match the persona she presented. I spoke to people she had known in the past. One friend from college hesitated at first but eventually confided, "She's complicated. She has a way of making herself look like the victim in every situation, even when it's not true." He shared incidents where she had lied about thefts, betrayals, and illnesses, all of which later turned out to be fabrications. Another acquaintance told me about her past relationships, each with eerily similar patterns. She would charm, manipulate, and then present herself as the one wronged, the one heartbroken. Partners and friends often felt guilty, apologizing for imagined mistakes, until they eventually withdrew entirely, exhausted and confused. I also discovered contradictions in her professional life. She claimed to be struggling at work due to unsupportive colleagues, but a closer look at her LinkedIn and public achievements revealed recognition, promotions, and compliments that didn't match the victim narrative she presented. She was creating a parallel reality, one for herself, one for the world. The more I learned, the more meticulous her manipulations seemed. Every lie, every tear, every moment of vulnerability she displayed was deliberate. It wasn't just deceit, it was performance art with real consequences. And it wasn't limited to strangers, friends, colleagues, even people she barely knew became part of her story. I started keeping a journal, documenting each discrepancy, every story that didn't add up. It became clear that exposing her would require precision. One wrong step could make her defensive, or worse, make others doubt me instead of her. That night, I sat alone, going over everything I had discovered. The realization hit me. The woman I thought needed protection, the one who had seemed so fragile and innocent, was actually orchestrating an elaborate web of lies. She wasn't merely pretending to be the victim, she was thriving on it. And as the weight of that truth settled in, I knew I was no longer just an observer. I had to be careful, but I also had to uncover the full extent of her deception before she trapped anyone else, or even me, in her web. I thought I was prepared for her lies, but when I faced her, I realized she had rehearsed this moment far better than I had. After weeks of careful observation, cross-checking stories, and documenting inconsistencies, I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. I had to confront her, not in public, where she thrived, but privately, where I could see the real reactions beneath her mask. I invited her for coffee at a quiet cafe, the kind with soft lighting and empty corners. I wanted to maintain calm, controlled conversation, but my heart pounded. This was a risk. If I misstepped, she could twist the situation, manipulate me, and make me the one in the wrong. She arrived, as always, smiling, perfectly poised. She greeted me with warmth, her voice soft, almost melodic. "I'm glad we could talk," she said, tilting her head slightly, her eyes sparkling with the charm I had once admired. I started cautiously, mentioning a few discrepancies I had noticed, small ones, to gauge her reaction. At first, she seemed confused, blinking slowly, tilting her head. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling just enough to appear sincere. "Maybe you misunderstood." But then came the classic move I had begun to recognize. She shifted the blame, asking questions with a tone so gentle it disarmed me. "Are you saying you don't trust me?" Her lips quivered slightly. "After everything I've shared with you." Suddenly, my notes, my evidence, even my own gut instincts seemed to wobble. She was so convincing, so rehearsed in the art of appearing wronged. I pressed further, citing specific incidents and inconsistencies. She countered smoothly, turning facts into questions, spinning narratives I hadn't anticipated. Each word was calculated. Every pause, every blink, every slight shake of her hand was designed to evoke doubt, guilt, and sympathy. I realized then that this confrontation wasn't just about me exposing her, it was a performance, and she had been preparing for it all along. For nearly an hour, the conversation twisted and turned. I stayed vigilant, carefully noting contradictions while trying not to react emotionally. It was exhausting. My mind raced with evidence, counter-arguments, and strategies, but she had an uncanny ability to make me second-guess myself. By the end of the meeting, I walked away with a mix of fear and clarity. Fear because her manipulations were far more sophisticated than I had imagined. Clarity because I now knew without a doubt, she was not just pretending to be the victim occasionally, she lived in that role, and anyone who fell for it would be trapped in her world. That night, I reviewed my notes, replaying the confrontation in my mind. I realized exposing her would require meticulous planning. I couldn't rely on emotion or intuition alone, I needed concrete proof, evidence that even her most convincing theatrics couldn't deny. And so, the next phase began, gathering the evidence she couldn't twist, the proof that would finally show the world who she really was.